Hello, wonderful people of the internet. Today I'm going to be comparing two really famous and really popular fantasy series, and those are Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien and Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. Now, the goal here is to decide which one is best, and that means that there's going to be a lot of my opinion in this video. And before I begin, I just want to let you know that I'm not telling you what to think. I'm not telling you that your preferences are wrong. If you're a Potterhead, that's fine. I used to be a really big Potterhead as well. Harry Potter's great. I'm not disrespecting you. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. I'm not disrespecting you either. I've tried to look at this as critically as possible and make it as unbiased as I possibly can. So hopefully I've been fair in my decisions here. So let's get into it. I've got 6 sort of sections that I'm going to be analysing, and I will be giving a point to either series for whichever one does this section better. So there's going to be world building, characters, plot, influence, writing style, and magic system, since they are both fantasy series. So the first one is setting. So in The Lord of the Rings, we have Middle-earth, which is like the world today, but fantasy, because this takes place like centuries before where we are now. And that means that Tolkien has taken a lot of creative decisions. You know, he's got things that don't actually exist in the story, like big elven cities, big mines at the bottom of mountains, the Shire with all the hobbit holes inside of them, whereas Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling is written in the modern era. So you've got places like King Cross Station, and I don't believe Privet Drive is a real place, but it's, you know, a very much modern setting, you know, an English town. So, which one of these is better? I've thought about it a lot, because in Harry Potter you've got Hogwarts, and there's, you know, the whole layout for Hogwarts. I'm sure there's a map of Hogwarts somewhere, and that's really, really good. But, there is a but. Lord of the Rings, you know what, I'll just show you. So next to the camera here, I've got this bad boy. And this is the Atlas of Tolkien's Middle-earth. Now this is exactly what it says on the package. It is an atlas for all of the places in Middle-earth, from the first age of the world to the third age of the world. And they were all these maps in here were hand-drawn by Tolkien himself. And while I haven't read this, because there's so much of it, the fact that there is an atlas of this size for a book series is just mind-blowing. The amount of effort he put into that is astonishing. So, on the terms of sort of the general setting, I feel like The Lord of the Rings here wins here. But we're not done on the world-building section yet, because then we've got a few other things, like the history of the worlds and the languages, which really only applies to Lord of the Rings. Okay, so with Harry Potter, I feel like there isn't a lot of history to Harry Potter. Now, please forgive me if I'm wrong, because it's been quite a while since I've read these, and Lord of the Rings for that matter, but I've rewatched the movies of Lord of the Rings more recently, so my memory of the story is a bit better. But in the Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, in Harry Potter, you don't have that much history to go on. You know about the history of Hogwarts, the Horcruxes, the Chamber of Secrets. That is all there. The founders of Hogwarts. There's a lot of good history there. But on the terms of magical history, I don't feel like there's a lot in here. Like, where did magic come from? What were the first wizards like? There's not much of that in here. And so I feel like this is definitely a tad worse than Lord of the Rings, which has a Bible, which I will grab now. This is the Silmarillion. And as I said before, this is essentially the Bible for The Lord of the Rings. It's got loads of myths, and there might be a creation story in there, I'm not sure, but it definitely describes the first era of Middle-earth and all of the events in that. And that's so crazy for me, because this takes place centuries before The Lord of the Rings, and yet Tolkien's taken the time to detail how all of the races came to Middle-earth and the setup for The Lord of the Rings. So while Harry Potter has a great history for Hogwarts, and that's really interesting, to actually have a history for the fantasy world and essentially a Bible, is amazing. Plus, The Lord of the Rings was written by Tolkien because of languages. Tolkien was an English professor, and he loved language. And what he did is he invented Elvish. It's a real language. Elvish is a real language. You can learn to speak it. I'm sure it's on a website somewhere. There are probably YouTube videos about it. It's a language with grammatical structure, verbs, adjectives. It's all there, and he wrote Elvish. He wrote The Lord of the Rings even, so that Elvish would have a world to exist in. So, another layer of world building there. You've got real languages that you can learn to speak inside of it. So overall, the point goes to Lord of the Rings for world building, because there's an atlas for the world, there's a Bible, and there's a real language you can learn related to it. I mean, Harry Potter didn't really stand a chance here. Okay, so the second section is characters. And this one's really tough for me, because Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter both do good things with the characters. So I'll start with the Lord of the Rings this time. In the Lord of the Rings, you have quite a large cast of characters. I'm going to say 10 main characters, 8 to 10 main characters, or important characters, are in this series. And what I feel is that Lord of the Rings suffers from what I'm going to call classic syndrome. So classic books, all the ones that I've read, have this feeling when all the characters speak in the same way. Almost they don't have many things to differentiate from each other when the characters are speaking. Like, there are a few exceptions in this. There's Samwise Gamgee, who calls his friend, Mr. Frodo. You know it's him speaking. That's his idiosyncrasy, Mr. Frodo. And then you've also got Gollum, my precious. He speaks really weirdly, so he's got his own idiosyncrasies as well. But as far as dialogue goes for the characters in Lord of the Rings, there isn't much there. Whereas in Harry Potter, there is a lot of character in the dialogue in these books. Ron's funny, Hermione's clever, and Draco Malfoy's just a stuck-up A-word. So, you've got really definite characters there. Bellatrix, sort of crazy, Umbridge, Satan incarnate. Just through the dialogue, you get a lot in there. And since I'm on Harry Potter, I'll carry on. Also, what the characters do tends to portray a lot of personality. Now, I did some research online to help me with my decisions, and I found that it was almost universally agreed that the best characters in Harry Potter were Voldemort, Dumbledore, and Snape. And I didn't have any trouble believing that, because Dumbledore was really good. And with the Fantastic Beasts series, which is a film series coming out, it's adding more depth to the character. He's really good. Then you've got Voldemort and his backstory in the orphanage and how he became the Dark Lord that he is also really good. And Snape, which tends to be the most well-respected character in the series, with his... I won't talk about it because it is a spoiler, but Snape is a really detailed character with complex motivations, so there is definitely a lot of good stuff with the characters in Harry Potter. But there are also a few issues, and that would be that, I don't know, Harry Potter doesn't feel, as a character, very unique to me. He's quite bland, just the teenage male protagonist. And that's my opinion. I've read a lot of people saying that he's really good. And that's just, that's opinion again. I'm just giving you my 2 cents. But I feel like there are some characters in the book that don't really have very good personalities for them. They're sort of background characters who are very much archetypes. Like, what could an example be? I know that Neville was quite important, but in the first few books, he was just, the loser. Everything's going wrong for him. He hasn't got much beyond that. He's forgetful. He loses things. He doesn't know. He doesn't do magic very well. That's him. Then you've got Seamus. He makes things go bang. That's his character. So there were some less complex characters in Harry Potter. And then moving back to the Lord of the Rings, while the dialogue was not that great, some of the characters in this were really memorable, and 2 of those are Sam and Gollum, but there are other ones, like Eowyn, who is like the first Mulan, the woman who isn't allowed to fight, but does everything in her power to be able to. And there's Gandalf, who is essentially Dumbledore, and you've got, who else is there off the top? Pippin and Merry, they're a really good comedic duo. You've got Gimli and Legolas, who are also a really good comedic duo. And all the characters in this have their own motivations, their reasons for wanting to destroy this ring and going on this quest together. And that's really good. They all have a reason to be there, and they all have their own beliefs and things like that. But overall, I made this a draw, because while Harry Potter does have a few bland characters, it has some really, really complex ones as well, and it has great dialogue, whereas Lord of the Rings has a few more complex characters, but the letdown is in the dialogue, which is hard to differentiate between characters if there wasn't the said Gandalf, said Frodo. So that's a point goes to each in that case. Next is the magic system. Now, both of these things are what we call a soft magic system. There are hard magic systems, there are soft magic systems. Hard means that there are very, very strict rules that the person has to follow when performing magic. There's things like Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn and Fullmetal Alchemist's Alchemy. They have the rules are never broken, you know how the magic works. Whereas in Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, it's a bit softer. Now, Harry Potter is on the harder side, but it is still soft. You know, you've got the spells, you've got the basic things there that you can cast, whereas in Lord of the Rings you have essentially nothing. Magic in this is very much a force of nature, hard to understand, unpredictable. Magic stuff just happens and there's very little explanation for it. Gandalf is a good example of that. I won't get into why, but if you've read it, you know what I mean. His magic is never explained, he just does it. And while it certainly is good for spectacle, it's not explained. But it is, if you look at the Lord of the Rings wiki online, there is a lot of detail behind the magic system on there. But, overall, I thought this had to go to Harry Potter, because it does, I would say Lord of the Rings, but I feel a lot more people would say Harry Potter, because it has got that structure. You say the spell comes out. You know how it works. It's definitely a lot more accessible to understand than Lord of the Rings. So Harry Potter gets that point. Next we have the plot. And this was really, 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 really difficult for me to decide, because Harry Potter is a big 7-book series. You're watching Harry grow up from, like a wee 11-year-old to a young adult as he goes through his wizarding education and battles against Voldemort. And that's a great story. You've got him growing up, but with magic. So, you can't go wrong there. And there's a lot of good... It's a great story. Each book has its own individual arc, and that's really good. I loved the Harry Potter story, and definitely when I finished it, I felt really satisfied, We've come all this way, and it's a good ending. And then, in Lord of the Rings, it's not the wizard education one. This is like the first quest book. A group of people embark on a great quest to achieve a goal that will save the world. And there's a lot of scope to it. The characters in Lord of the Rings have to go across the whole country. They go through different cities, different biomes, encounter different types of people. The scope is amazing, and that's why there's an atlas, because Tolkien had to know his world for this sort of journey to happen. So in this, and there are huge battles in this, and huge events that rope in with the entire world that are really, really good in this. So, a good way to summarise my feelings, in Harry Potter, it's about Harry Potter growing up and, battling against Voldemort and going through his wizard education. Whereas in Lord of the Rings, it's very much a quest in an already established world. So I gave this point to Lord of the Rings just because I felt the scope was a lot wider. It was this cast of characters. A bit like D&D, Dungeons & Dragons, which is a role-playing game. You can look at that online if you want to. You have a big adventure with loads of big battles. It's just a lot bigger than Harry Potter, which is isolated, sort of Hogwarts. That's where most of the stuff happens. Whereas in Lord of the Rings, it goes everywhere. One minute you're in Rohan, then you're in Mordor, then you're in the Shire, then you're in Lothlorien. You travel everywhere in the Lord of the Rings, and that's why I said that the plot was better in here. Now we get onto influence. And one of the reasons that Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings are such a great thing to compare is that the influence of these stories is massive. So let me get into how these books have influenced the fantasy genre. So I'll start with Lord of the Rings, because Lord of the Rings actually was written before Harry Potter. So what Lord of the Rings did was it took the fantasy genre, which was very much viewed as for children before then. You hadn't had many fantasy books. You'd had Alice in Wonderland, probably a few things before that. I don't know if the Neverending Story was written before Lord of the Rings, but they were all aimed towards children. All the fantasy is a children's genre. Adults don't read it. Lord of the Rings changed that. It made a fantasy story that is definitely more read and enjoyed by adults than it is children. And so that meant that the fantasy genre could grow and become what it is today. It enabled things like Harry Potter to be written because it became so much more popular. You know, you got Game of Thrones from this. You got Harry Potter from this. What other fantasy series are there? You got His Dark Materials from this. You got Discworld from this. I don't think you would have got them if this hadn't been written and revolutionised the genre for a wider audience. Then what Harry Potter did was it invented the young adult genre. So when J.K. Rowling wrote this, there wasn't a classification for this. It was a fantasy book, sure, but no one knew what to call it because it's not for adults, but it's not for children. It's like a teenage book, and that wasn't a thing at the time. So what they did is they made young adult, and Harry Potter young adult is such a huge genre these days. You've got things like The Hunger Games, Chaos Walking, Skullduggery Pleasant, you've got His Dark Materials, you've got The Inheritance Cycle, you've got Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, Percy Jackson, Mortal Engines. I could go on forever. The amount of books that exist in the fantasy genre, which Harry Potter created, is amazing. Another thing that Lord of the Rings did was it introduced a lot of tropes. Now what a trope is it's a thing that tends to recur in a genre. Things like, the wizard with the pointy hat, the big mentor character, and the quest sort of idea. There are a lot of fantasy stories which are set as quests, and this also inspired the Wheel of Time, which is a really famous fantasy series as well, which is getting a Amazon Prime adaptation, so take a look at that. Just an offhand comment. But yeah, this definitely established a lot of tropes, which are also used in Harry Potter. Gandalf and Dumbledore are very similar as characters. They're the old wise wizard, So I gave this a draw as well, like with the characters, because both of these just did so many huge things for the fantasy genre that I really couldn't decide which one was more important. Like, yes, Harry Potter might not have existed without Lord of the Rings, but then so many other things wouldn't have existed without Harry Potter, so I feel like they both get a point here. Now my last one is the writing style. And that's a bit difficult to talk about, because Lord of the Rings was written like a century before Harry Potter was, which means that the writing styles are very different. Harry Potter is a young adult book, Lord of the Rings is an adult book, so the writing style is going to be hugely different. But what I have done is I found some extracts from both stories to sort of compare. Now this was very rushed, I probably haven't found the best quotes in either of them, but I just thought, right, I find a description of Hogwarts in Harry Potter, I find a description of Lothlorien, which is, I was scrolling through and I thought that was a good description in Lord of the Rings, and we'll compare. So, the one I found in Harry Potter was, where was it? I'm not describing Hogwarts, I'm describing the Great Hall, and I might read the extract about the Sorting Hat after that. Harry had never even imagined such a strange and splendid place. It was lit by thousands and thousands of candles which were floating in mid-air over 4 long tables, where the rest of the students were sitting. These tables were laid with glittering golden plates and goblets. At the top of the hall was another long table, where the teachers were sitting. So, that's a really good description. I get the image straight in my head. The Great Hall is, iconic. It's one of the main settings of Harry Potter, and I feel like this is a great description of it. Now, I'll try and find the Sorting Hat for you. I'll cut out me scrolling through the book so that I don't bore you. Oh, hang on, it's on the same page. How very, very silly of me. Okay. Harry quickly looked down again as Professor McGonagall silently placed a 4-legged stool in front of the first years. On top of the store she put a pointed wizard's hat. This hat was patched and frayed and extremely dirty. Aunt Petunia wouldn't have let it in the house. Maybe they had to try and get a rabbit out of it, Harry thought wildly. That seemed the sort of thing. Noticing that everyone in the hall was now staring at the hat, he stared at it too. For a few seconds there was a complete silence, then the hat twitched, a rip near the brim opened wide like a mouth, and the hat began to sing. So that's really good as well. I like the note about how Aunt Petunia wouldn't have let it in the house, because Aunt Petunia as a character, it really helps you see it, because you know what Aunt Petunia's like, and you know that if Aunt Petunia wouldn't let it in the house, you get an idea of how old and dirty and miserable this hat looks. Okay, so now I'm going to read out an extract from The Lord of the Rings. Under the night, the trees stood tall before them, arched over the road and stream that ran suddenly beneath their spreading boughs. In the dim light of the stars, their stems were grey, and their quivering leaves a hint of fallow gold. Now, that is really flowing. It's like poetry. That's the thing with Lord of the Rings. It's got classic syndrome, but that also means that the writing is really, 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 really beautiful. There's another bit here. The night wind blew chill up the valley to meet them. Before them a wide grey shadow loomed, and they heard an endless rustle of leaves like poplars in the breeze. Yeah, it just reads so nicely. It's like honey. I don't know. It's hard to describe, but it's so nice to listen to. It is like poetry. And while Harry Potter is really good at describing them, it puts the image in your head. It's not as flowery and flowing as Lord of the Rings, and that is why I gave Lord of the Rings the writing style point. Now this is actually really subjective because Harry Potter's a young adult book, Lord of the Rings is a classic fantasy book. They're so different in how they're written, it's purely up to you which one you prefer. And I know that a lot of people don't like Lord of the Rings because they couldn't read it because of the writing style, but I personally prefer how I think that The Fellowship of the Ring, The Lord of the Rings, has a better writing style from a literary point of view. Now, I might prefer reading Harry Potter, and I definitely do. I'm thinking from a literary point of view, Lord of the Rings has a better writing style. Okay, so now we come to the conclusion. Who has won the fight? So, we have got a score of 5-3, and that goes to Lord of the Rings. So this was a really close, if you want to call it a fight, this was a close fight. They both got some really good points. They both had their pros and their cons, but I just feel like Lord of the Rings comes out on top here. And as I said before, if you're a Potterhead, I'm not disrespecting you. I love Harry Potter. I cannot deny it's a great series. I just feel that Lord of the Rings is a lot better. And I might be biased. I tried not to be. But I think a lot of people would agree with me as well. And you might want to read a few essays online. I'm sure there will be them. Just search up, is Lord of the Rings better than Harry Potter? Or is Harry Potter better than Lord of the Rings? And you will get some good and certainly more detailed reviews of that. Okay, so that's me. I really hoped you enjoyed, and thank you so much for watching. Have a good one, y'all, and bye.